So today we will be going to look at God of the Gaps fallacy from the perspective of atheists, and we will try to analyze whether it is actually a fallacy or not. So let's begin.
That out of the way, today I'm going to review a conversation I had with a couple theists, who argued that things like math or morality indicate the existence of God, and how in doing so they were ultimately using what I would consider a God of the gaps argument. Now, of course, nobody wants to think they're using this kind of argument. The phrase God of the gaps is used by atheists, rightly or not depending on the situation, to brush off a theistic argument as fallacious, and even most theists are aware enough of its shortcomings to want to distance themselves from it.
This is a wrong way to look at the problem. Let's try to understand it through the use of Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument has its first premise as whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, to those people who agree that such is the case, Kalam cosmological is very appealing to them, or could be very appealing to them, depending on the validity and appeal of the second premise. But to those people who reject the first premise altogether, Kalam cosmological argument is not a good way to convince them. That does not mean that it is fallacious. All arguments are only good as their premises. If the premise is not accepted by a particular person, that does not mean that the premise is false or unreasonable, but it means that the person who does not accept the premise uh, has some issue based on perhaps his own prior beliefs in accepting that premise. Or maybe premise is not reasonable, but the other people who accept that premise are basically in the wrong. In any case, just because a particular group disagrees with an argument or disagrees with a particular premise of an argument does not mean that the argument itself is weak or faulty. A lot of people do accept the validity and strength of Kalam cosmological argument, even those who are not theists. Similarly, God of the gaps argument will not convince any person who believes that using God to explain any element of natural theology is not appropriate. If they are starting from that prior, obviously to them God of gaps arguments are not convincing. But to any other person they would be convincing. So when a theist is trying to convince an atheist who believes that incorporation of natural theology in explaining any phenomena by putting its agency to God is problematic, would not work. But it would work if the atheist does not have this belief. Because most atheists have this kind of belief, as you will see from this atheist's argument as he moves on. God of the gaps is basically not a good tool in those situations. It does not mean that it is fallacious. An argument is only fallacious if it commits an overreach in logic. But given the premises, God of the gaps argument is logically valid. It, not, it might not be most satisfying, or that is another point.
The reason for this is pretty clear. In its purest, most transparent form, a God of the gaps argument is doing something we all recognize as silly, which is looking at something we can't currently explain and just saying God did it.
And this is basically a straw man of God of the gaps argument. Even this video is part of the video by this atheist about whether math and morality can be explained by the existence of God. He himself recognizes in this video, although this is merely a part of it, that math and morality being abstract are something that theists use in order to point out or in order to argue that their existence implies existence of God. Now, math and morality are specifically taken up because they are abstracts, and abstracts are very hard to explain under naturalism. This is something that even naturalists recognize. So it is not just looking at something that cannot be explained right now and saying that God did it. In this very case in which he is making this argument, it is being used to tackle the concept or the problem of the abstract, which has been plaguing philosophy for the last several thousand years. This comment, which is presumably by Richard Dawkins, is basically a giant straw man. It goes If you don't understand how something works, never mind, just give up and say God did it. But who is giving up? Philosophers who are trying to push God's existence as the reason behind the existence of morality or maths, effectiveness of maths, are not giving up. They regularly deal with naturalist critiques in philosophical papers and have been doing so for many, many years. They are trying to understand from where these abstracts come. Generally, the argument is forwarded when it is believed that the naturalism cannot adequately explain certain phenomena that we observe or what we believe to be true, and thus they may be caused by some supernatural entity. There's a reason why pointing out that an argument is God of the gaps itself is fallacious because it always relies on straw man of the argument. Even in this case, we do not see the premises of the argument. We see a very primitive or naive characterization of those arguments, as if those arguments actually have the logical structure similar to what Dawkins is attributing to them. But if indeed God of the gap arguments are such silly, why resort to straw man to point out that God of the gaps arguments are silly? If indeed someone has to resort to straw man of such arguments, it means that they internally recognize the validity and strength of those arguments.
Not only is this a blindingly obvious fallacy, jumping straight to a pre existing answer that you want to believe in rather than admitting you don't know what you don't know,
And this is where we see how atheism interacts with the Enlightenment epistemology. All of this problem starts from the Enlightenment, where Enlightenment philosophers use this technique to somehow declare themselves as more reasonable than the rest of the population, though they are clearly not. If you look at the works of Mill or a person like Russell, they often employ this tactic where they accuse the person they are disagreeing with of using an argument in which they already believe in the conclusion of that argument. But funnily enough, there is something that almost everyone does. That is called making an argument. That is called defending your point of view. A person has a point of view, a belief, and he looks at the external surroundings and he tries to fit in data within his worldview. And if the worldview explains the data, it's a hit. And this is how people try to justify their worldviews. This is something that everybody does, even in the field of sciences. In the field of the sciences, scientists who subscribe to different types of scientific theories use the external data in order to show its connection to their worldview. For example, Sean Carroll, who himself argued that Craig was using God of the Gaps, uses the external data or the evidence in order to bolster his model, which is against or which is in contradiction to the mainstream model, which is accepted by the most scientists. So is Sean Carroll being unreasonable? Is Sean Carroll thinking, doing something unethical? Is making a fallacious argument? Obviously, many atheists do not believe that. And this is the reason why God of the Gaps argument is characterized as such. It is an argument that attacks a specific point of view. It is only applicable uh, to theists' arguments. And this is the reason why it distinguishes itself from all the other types of fallacy by pointing out that it is specifically referring to the theist's arguments in its very naming, God of the Gaps. If God of the Gaps fallacy is referring to a general fallacy, why not use that fallacy? But the reason why that fallacy is not used is because it can be used to attack multiple arguments and not just theistic arguments. But that is not what atheists want to do. So they have manufactured their own version of a fallacy, which is only applicable to theists or theistic arguments. It is a very egoistical approach, which is something that directly comes from the Enlightenment, wherein Enlightenment philosophers used to declare the ideologies or the beliefs of their opponents as fallacious by very nature or by very definition. This is again something that can be seen in the works of J.S. Mill Bertrand Russell. And here the similar approach is taken. It is something like if someone says that it is a Republican fallacy, or it is a capitalist fallacy. That fallacy obviously does only work when a particular person of the opposing point or of the opposing side is making an argument. This is not a generalized fallacy. It is basically begging the question. The atheist considers moves by theists to be unreasonable because he is an atheist. This does not make the moves by or maneuvers by the theist unreasonable just because atheists think so. Because obviously atheists and theists differ in the epistemology. It would be similar to a Marxist pointing out fallacies of capitalism, fallacies specifically attributed to capitalism, or talking about capitalist greed. Greed is not just related to capitalist people, either it is a normal, natural psychological phenomenon that affects almost everybody, or it does not affect everybody. It would be bizarre to suggest that only capitalists are inflicted with greed. It somehow connects an ideology to something that is a psychological situation of almost all humanity. The similar move is done by the atheists. It ascribes the defense of the worldview, that is something that all humans do, no matter their political persuasion, and argues that only theists do it in this context. And if they believe that other people do it as well, then why call this fallacy with such specificity as God of the gaps, such that it cannot be used in other situations?
But it harkens back to the most ancient primitive behavior we stereotypically associate with our ancestors, which is staring in stupefied awe at lightning or fire or the sun and concluding they must be somehow supernatural.
And this is where we see the implication that is reached if someone adopts post hoc reasoning in his favor. And this is also something that comes from the Enlightenment. For example, from the Enlightenment, we know that those texts which basically determine that all people that existed before the Enlightenment era were savages or brutes came into being and were widely popularized. Every other person belonging to every other race was declared ignorant and stupid. This is basically, as pointed out earlier, an egoistical approach. Most of the time, when we try to attribute agency while observing a phenomenon, we are right on the point. A person who is using post hoc reasoning looks at only failures of such a principle and tries to show why the principle is wrong just based on its failures. However, when we are using a principle of distinguishing what is right and what is wrong, we look at its total effectiveness and not just at its failures. Looking at its failures to determine its validity is problematic because it assumes that a particular principle must have to be perfect in order to be used. But that is pragmatically not possible. Just like, for example, a principle like innocent until proven guilty is not 100% foolproof. So how can one expect such a principle of finding an agency in the happenings of the nature to be 100% perfect? That is not even possible. But because we now know that perhaps lightning and earthquakes are natural phenomena, we use those specifically in order to attack ancient people and their intelligence, even though by finding out patterns and attributing them to agents, ancient men were very successful in developing these societies to the point where now we exist and live with such wealth that was not possible in such early eras. Most of the time, whenever we see some happening whose cause we don't know of, if we find that such a happening is very random and not deterministic, we attribute that to agents. So, for example, if someone poisons some other person and that other person dies, ancient people knew that the person was poisoned and that poisoning was done by some agent. That was because people do not deterministically die like that. We believe from our own example whether free will exists or it is an illusion. But the only people who are capable of making, the only entities that are capable of making free choices are those who are conscious. And thus, if we see any happening in the world that occurs randomly or not deterministically, we attribute agency to it. Because obviously, lightning and earthquakes could not have been caused by natural or normal human beings. It was believed that some form of superhumans, but conscious agents, were causing those. Still now, we do not know the exact time when an earthquake or a lightning would happen. It is still indeterministic and maybe would remain so because it is the very nature of our world, as we see from quantum mechanics. If it is indeterministic, what other being we have that we also believe acts in an indeterministic manner? Well, that is a conscious being. So perhaps it is a great analogical argument that may not always be valid, but it is valid a lot of times. If you see something that you possess gets lost, we often think whether it has been stolen or not. But why do we think so? Because it is a very random occurrence. If something that you have or possess vanishes and is no longer observable, that is attribution of agency. And if that occurs in such a manner that we cannot attribute it to normal people, we would attribute it to supernatural entities. Similarly, if your disease gets cured and you do not know why and how it got cured, then perhaps you would want to attribute that randomness to the randomness that is possible uh, through agents, conscious agents. And that is a good analogical argument that also may not be valid many times, but it is valid in many other cases. So perhaps overall, it is a good principle to hold. Now that could be debatable, and that is something that can be debated. But trying to analyze a principle using post hoc reasoning applied to its failures is indeed fallacious, and there cannot be two views about it. And this is the reason why claiming that God of the Gaps arguments are fallacious is fallacious itself, because it is dependent on a post hoc reasoning. Not only it is dependent on post hoc reasoning, it is dependent on begging the question that it is naturalism that can explain every natural phenomenon, of which we have no evidence. There might be other agents, even if they are not God, that may come into play while discussing several things that happen in human history. They may also play a part, in which case the explanation would not be naturalistic, would be something more than naturalistic. Because a naturalist does not believe that such supernatural occurrences can happen, he believes that the God of the Gaps arguments are fallacious. But that is just bias in favor of naturalism. And this is the reason why God of the Gaps fallacy is a very specific fallacy that is only applied to theistic arguments because it is based on presumption that naturalism is true, which merely begs the question.
Now keep in mind, I'm not saying this is how ancient humanity should be fairly characterized. After all, I did refer to it as a stereotype.
But if he's referring to it as a stereotype, why is he using it to bolster his argument? That does not make any sense.
And my point is not to delve into the nuance of ancient thinking, as much as point out the baggage that comes with a God of the Gaps label. In its most extreme forms, at least, it represents the clearest opposite of scientific thinking we can imagine.
And that is because science implies methodological naturalism. So obviously a supernatural explanation is in contravention to it. But that doesn't mean that supernatural explanation is faulty. This somehow equivocates science to truth, and that has never been shown to be true. First of all, the atheists or naturalists would argue that we should apply methodological naturalism when dealing with natural objects. And that perhaps makes sense, but that somehow is now equated with truth. And thus it is argued that anything that does not apply methodological naturalism is unscientific. And what is unscientific is unreasonable or untrue. That is extending principle beyond its reach. And it is a very dishonest and disingenuous move.
Automatically being mystified by the world and jumping to clear, easy answers about it instead of investigating it.
This is also a problematic statement. And you can see that in all of these parts, and in this small part of the whole video, there's already said several things which are unreasonable. Just because someone is looking at an easy answer does not mean that that easy answer is wrong. In fact, an easy answer is, in some ways, in some forms of epistemology, believed to be better than a hard answer. Why seeking out easy answers is problematic? The validity of answers should be checked based on its reasoning and its logic, not whether it is easy to obtain or hard to obtain. It's also very interesting to say that adopting easy answers and not investigating is bad. But the person who is making the video, is he investigating natural phenomena? No, he's using this to bolster his point of view. Again, we have this very stupid, egoistical enlightenment concept, which shows that the good side is investigating things, while the other side is blindly or believing into things, blindly believing in things. How many people, atheists, are going around trying to understand natural phenomena? How many of them who are on the YouTube and make counter apologetic counter apologetical arguments are invested in science for going out in the field and contributing to the world of science and knowledge by their own contribution, by their own hard work. Most of them do not have, most of them even do not have, seem to be related in any way to the field of science. So why present yourself as such when you know that is not true? Why present your group as such when you know that it is not true? If it was true that there were some people who were investigating the natural phenomena and some people were taking easy answers, perhaps you would be justified. But that is not what is happening. You are using uh, some arguments to stand in front of a camera and to propagate atheism, and someone is using the very same means to propagate theism. Why one is better than the other when you are doing similar kind of work? If you would indeed working out in the field and investigating natural phenomena, perhaps we would have more respect to your point of view. Still, it would not show that your point of view is correct, but perhaps it could mean that we would have more respect. But that is not what you are doing. You are making videos in support of your point of view. Is that hard work? It is not any more hard work than a theist who is standing in front of camera and reading out a script. So what is the difference? What is the objective difference? Not a difference based on your subjective feelings.
So you can imagine why theists don't want to be associated with these arguments.
Again, as I said, theists do not want to be associated with the argument because it is not a good tool to convince atheists who do not believe that natural theology is an acceptable means for deciphering existence of God. And you will see that this atheist would accept that shortly.
Why they chafe at being accused of using them and want to be clear that theirs are not God of the Gaps arguments. But regardless of how badly apologists want to distance themselves from the label, or project some version of it onto others, as inspiring Fallacy did with his I know you are but what am I strategy of saying atheists just use science of the gaps arguments, I would contend that almost all apologetics fall back to some form of God of the gaps.
And this proves my point how this type of rhetoric is just begging the question. The atheists are not interested in accepting any natural theology, any argument from natural theology as an acceptable argument for the existence of God, by definition. Because if you say that anything that is done by, if you say anything that is naturally occurring is done through the agency of God, atheists can always say, but wait, naturalism or science would show that it happens naturally. And the reason why they say that is because they have a prior belief that naturalism is true or that science can explain all of reality. This is basically a giant circle. They start from the idea that naturalism is true. Because naturalism is true, there cannot be a supernatural explanation for natural phenomena. And because there is no supernatural explanation for natural phenomena, naturalism is true. This is how they develop their epistemology. It is kind of a very Marxist way, just like the Marxists have this circular argument. So they start from the point that there's a bunch of oppressors who are oppressing the oppressed, and there cannot be a counterexample to that, because that counterexample can eventually be explained by some oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. And because that dichotomy does always hold, or is expected to hold given enough time for Marxists to find the applicability of that principle in almost every situation, Marxism is true. There is a very similar thing that is happening here, and it is thus just arguing in bad faith. The atheists do not normally believe that some types of theistic arguments are fallacious that use natural theology. They believe every such argument is fallacious. And if indeed every such argument is fallacious, they have done what I said before. They have literally defined the other side as being fallacious, or the other point of view as being fallacious by definition, which is something very similar to what liberal Enlightenment philosophers did. This is an easy way for them in order to enforce their point of view. But it's not necessarily correct. In fact, it is very likely to be false because it uses bizarre methodology in order to prove its point of view. And this is the reason why God of the gaps arguments are not fallacious. They are just unappealing to many atheists. But that is the case with all arguments. Not all arguments appeal to all people. Just because an atheist says or believes that any argument that does not appeal to him is fallacious, that does not mean that such an argument is fallacious. In fact, God of the gaps argument cannot be shown to be logically fallacious and has never been shown to be. It has always been shown to be fallacious by using arguments that employ use of absurdity, just like pointing out how people in ancient times used to believe in supernatural agencies. This is basically post hoc reasoning. Using that, almost anything can be proven. Any principles can be proven to be faulty. For example, we can prove the principle of induction to be faulty by using specific examples when principle of induction failed. But still science uses it. But very few atheists seem to have problem with that. And again, it comes back to the fact that because they already believe science to be justified, or naturalism to be justified, they have this prior bias in favor of their own point of view. And thus, this rhetoric is clearly circular and begs the question in favor of their point of view, which itself is a fallacy. So the fallacy, if any, and is present here, is not God of the gaps, the fallacy of begging the question.